Hello, this is Meet the Writers. I'm Georgina Godwin. My guest today is a German playwright, essayist, theatre curator and novelist. The Berlin-based writer was born in Volgograd in the then-USSR and raised in Moscow until they were 10 when the family emigrated to Germany in 1995. They're the author of 3 books and 11 plays. Glorious People is their second novel. First published in German in 2021, it was longlisted for the German Book Prize. It won the 2022 Literaturhauser Prize and the Heinrich Heine Prize. And it's just been announced as the winner of the biggest prize in German literature, and that's the Heinrich von Kleist Prize. Sasha Salzmann, welcome to Meet the Writers.
Thank you for having me. I'm so delighted to be here.
Such an interesting life, Sasha, and I'm so pleased that you're on a flying visit to London and we've managed just to catch up to talk about everything that your book is about, because it very much intertwines with your life. I think it was your life inspired the book, and it's wonderful to be able to discuss your background. You were born in the former USSR. What do you remember of that? You left when you were 10, but being there in Volgograd as a small child, do you have any kind of clear recollections for that?
That's a valid question because, of course, as a writer and someone who is very much dedicated to writing down what you remember and understanding memory as also an archive, especially when your history is not part of the majority narrative, I'm constantly trying to remember and also trying to divide memory from wishful thinking, right? Growing up in Moscow, I do not remember really well, and I think it's connected to a very harsh life. It was a very poor life. It was outskirts of Moscow. My Jewish heritage was kind of like a problem from the start. This is what I remember. But I don't have vivid images of Moscow. What I do have, though, are very lively, wonderful memories of Volgograd, and especially the house my grand-grandparents had by the Volga, by the sea. And of course, I do remember it because that was vacation. This is where I learned to swim, but also because my grand-grandparents and my grandparents, that's my mother's side, they were just, my superheroes. They were speaking Yiddish to each other. They were cooking all this delicious food. And somehow the atmosphere was very much alive all the time. They were playing theater sketches on a daily. The Jewish humor was part of their normal day life. And that was a big contrast to Moscow. So I prefer to remember Volgograd.
And of course, that's obviously where your literary sensibilities were formed.
I'd say so. Thinking about where I come literally, I think being read as a Russian writer in Germany was always insane to me because although, of course, Russian is my mother tongue and my passport is Russian, was Russian, not anymore. Of course, I was 10 when we immigrated. I think that the culture that really formed my thinking was Jewish, just because, my family put this effort in it. And of course, I also read a lot of Russian literature, but the pride in Jewish culture was part of my upbringing.
So you moved to Germany when you were 10, as we said, in 1995. Why and how?
Well, there was this movement, former Soviet states. It was an invitation for Jewish refugees because the anti-Semitism was rising in a way that it became really dangerous to live there. I have stories from my parents how this decision came about. You can imagine me with 10, I was just brought to Germany. And it's interesting because I do remember good things. I still remember the train ride. I even put it down in my first novel, Beside Myself. And for me, it was a trip. I like adventures, and I bet for my parents it was a very, very harsh experience. I do not remember the suffering. I just remember, wow, that was like this huge jump we did, and suddenly it was a new culture, and I grew up with very diverse people. I don't remember being like, one thing, and suddenly I'm in the middle of something completely different, like just German. There were all kind of people, and I always grew up with all kind of people, and I like that.
But of course, your whole identity has changed since then. Your name, your gender, everything.
Exactly, yes. Yeah, I guess movement is just something within me. I totally understand people who say this is too much for me, or it is a challenge, or migration for most of people is a very harsh thing to survive. And then you have to check the privileges you get when you arrive, right? With a certain skin color, with a certain last name. My original last name is Salzmann, but I was born with another last name and also first name because my parents were trying to make it easier for my brother and me to survive in Russia. And when they took back the Jewish name, I was kind of upset. I was like, oh, now you're not hiding? So how is that? How does it work? There was this feeling that you cannot be yourself. You always have to adapt to certain situations, which might be a Jewish experience for a lot of people. I was opposing it, of course, in my adolescent time. I was like, an angry teenager trying to figure out who I am. And I understood that the way for me is to go through literature and reading and writing and listening to other people. And it's not what's in your birth certificate, you know what I mean? It's not what it is in the paper. The paper said I'm a woman. I never felt like a woman. So that became a journey, an adventure, not necessarily always a fight, but something that I think is very important for all of us, just to decide for yourself who you are.
Well, as you say, a lot of that forged through literature. And let's look at your writing journey, because you studied literature, drama and media in Germany. And that's when your first poems and short stories were published in various magazines. Tell me about those early forays. And what do you think when you look back at that writing?
I'm surprised about this teenager who was already publishing stuff with I was 16, because I was always very insecure being a migrant and writing not in my mother tongue. But I do remember I was still writing. There was something that was stronger than my fear, or more curious about the world than my fears were. I quit school when I was 16, and I joined a theater in Hanover. That was a good state theater. They just accidentally took me in for a non-paid job, and then, like a bad paid job, and then a better paid job, that kind of story. And I think being in a very productive, inspiring surrounding, supported by a wonderful mentor who really took care of me, who said, I know you think you cannot write, but show me your texts. She was inspiring me. She was, always there for me. And so, of course, if you get this response that people are interested in what you do, and maybe it's published in a magazine, and maybe you even get a small fee, you're motivated to continue. And it took me a while to really apply to an art school, because I thought art schools are not for people like me. But I guess for real artists, to be honest, I'm here for this European Writers' Festival in London. And no matter which writer I talk to, we always say the same thing. I didn't study it. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to. And I think there's like a productive moment in being very humble with what you do. Not, like to beat your chest and say, like, I'm a writer and I was born a writer. It's all an experiment. It's all trial and error.
Absolutely. You staged 3 plays. You did a loose adaptation of Waiting for Godot. You did a sarcastic, romantic monologue to Vladimir Putin, and also a parody of the Joan of Arc story. You developed projects for the deaf and the hard of hearing. I mean, this is a lot for a teenager struggling with their identity.
But that was helping me. I think that art was my way to understand the world. If I didn't understand why I'm so angry about it, I just started writing. And theater is a very political space, because, the polis is there. There is no theater without the crowds. And this is something that we realized in the pandemic, very harsh, right? You need other people. Otherwise we go nuts. And I think being in a theater really helped me with understanding my identity without being in a constant crisis about my identity. It was all an experiment, and being so privileged to be able to express what I see and what I think about my society through art really helped me through times where I thought I should study something proper and learn the language well.
Be an accountant.
Exactly, be something. Of course, it comes with also this migrant experience that, of course, your parents risk everything, so you have a life. So you should have a life.
Now, you founded a magazine, translated Free Text. It was a cultural and social magazine way back in 2002.
Yeah, we were young. Those things you can do when you're young, because none of us was earning any money. We were putting our lives in it, but it was very successful for 11 years. So in the end, when we actually could live from it, we had to stop because people started to have families and had to move on. But it was a very great platform for marginalized voices. Back then, it was not a thing in Germany to have a platform for marginalized voices. The internet was not a thing. I mean, of course it existed, but not everybody was on Instagram figuring out about their community. So it was kind of like something that started as a community platform, but not for a certain community, but for everybody, basically, who understood themselves outside of the mainstream media.
You really found success with a play that I think is translated as Mother Tongue?
Yes.
Tell me more about that.
Well, that was I graduated with this piece. I started to study playwriting in University of Arts in Berlin, 2012. I finished. I graduated 2012 with Muttersprache Marmeloschen, which means mother tongue. Marmeloschen. Marmeloschen is the Yiddish word for mother tongue. And that was just insane, because I tried to figure out what I mean with my Jewish heritage, with my Jewish identity. Coming from a Soviet regime, Jewishness is, of course, not a religion. It's a culture, it's connected to certain languages, certain ideas, but it's really up to you what you make out of it. And I'm an atheist. So I was making my journey through a Jewishness, a diasporic Jewishness in Europe that resonated within me. At one point, I found out about this incredible, interesting musician, and not only klezmer, but also klezmer musician, but also a communist, Lynn Yaldati, who survived the Shoah, went to the GDR to create the so-called new human being, and was accused of being part of the Stasi. She was not, but of course, as a survivor and a woman and a communist, you can imagine it was also not fun to be Jewish. And I wrote basically based on her life or inspired by her life this piece about the three generations of women, grandmother, mother, and daughter, negotiating their relations and being very angry and funny and lovable, sometimes not so lovable. And all that is with a lot of Jewish jokes. And I thought it will not work in Germany. First of all, humor in Germany is not a thing, right? We all know that. It's official. It's international. Everybody knows that. And then it's Jewish humor, and the Jewish community is very, very small, so much smaller than in UK, for example, right? So I was super surprised about this huge success of the piece. It's translated in 20 languages or over 20 languages. And I remember even when I've been to Havana when they staged it there, and I thought this will never work in Cuba. But it did, because they also went through socialism. And I think it works universally because we all got a mom. So in the end, it's all about mothers and children and how we try to love and get along with each other.
Mm. You went off to Istanbul. You were doing a residency at a theatre there, but that was where your book, Beside Myself, came to you, if you like. Do you think you needed to be away to write this semi-autobiographical novel?
Oh, absolutely. And I understood it only when I read so much bigger, so much brighter writers like James Baldwin, who also needed to go away to start writing novels. And then I figured out that a lot of writers made the same inner journey. It's an emotional necessity to get away and to have a distance to where you come from, to understand what you actually carry within you. Mm. I'm not connected to Turkish culture, Istanbul at all, but I arrived there and I decided to stay forever. I graduated in 2012, as I said, and then I had this invitation for the residency only for 3 months, and I stayed for 4 years.
Wow.
Yeah. And if it would be up to me, I would still be there.
Yeah. Now, you finally did go back to Germany.
I did.
And you became writer-in-residence at the Maxim Gorky Theatre. That's Berlin's oldest theatre. You're still there?
I'm still there. I'm associated with the theatre. I'm not a part of the artistic team anymore, because then you have to be there. And I travel a lot. But this is a very special, specific gang of people who dedicate themselves to a very political theatre, to a very own aesthetic of theater, which always comes from what is going on in the society right now. And it invites the whole society, meaning really taking care of having people from outskirts in the theater, making people be able to pay the ticket and to enter the building.
Mm. And it, in fact, became Theatre of the Year under your guidance. Now, you've also co-founded the New Institute for Writing for the Stage. Tell us about that.
I love writing, and I love teaching writing, and I love young people or people who want to write, because I feel that this ambition is connecting you to the world in a very special way. I think that, to quote James Baldwin, writers, observers, we're witnesses to our times. Our obligation is to really look at what's going on. And I love to speak about that. So I founded with a colleague of mine, Maxi Obeksa, this institute where we systematically tried to figure out what could be the ways to give this opportunity to people who really want to take a look at their societies. Mm.
Now, in 2016, you declared yourself as queer. You came out as non-binary in 2020. And I wonder how that plays in Germany, where gender-neutral language is really very hotly debated.
Yeah, it's insane. It could be funny if it wouldn't be sad. I always knew that I'm not a woman. I didn't have the terms for it. We still don't really, we still use the English terms for it, right? And for me, it's highly interesting how the right wing and the far right are using my identity to push their hateful agendas, because I'm not really sure if people really care my gender or my sexuality or what I prefer, right? All these private informations are clearly just an excuse for people to say no to something contemporary or maybe even the future. Mm. I know that the future is very scary, and I understand that people are scared of everything that will come. To make queer people responsible for it is kind of sounds like a joke. I understand that we seem like too much information, but then I would prefer that people just don't care about us, right? If I'm too much, that's all right. You don't have to look at it. Mm. For me, it was a very political moment, because this is when the AfD, the far-right party in Germany, came to power, partly. Of course, not as a main party so far, knock on wood, but they entered the government. Since 1945, that was the first time that we had far-right in the German government. And they, of course, they jumped on this topic of gender queerness, gender harshly. And I have to say that now the situation is getting worse and worse because even parties from the so-called middle class, whoever that is, are catching up there because they understand that people don't want to move on. It's too much. It's too scary. It's too hard to live right now. And this is very much connected to new terms like gender neutral or non-binary. At the same time, we always existed, and I wrote quite a few things about that my identity is not a new identity. The words we have, the terms we have, the rights we demand might be new, but my reality is not a new reality.
Absolutely. And I mean, the thing is that, so that's one part of your identity, which is controversial in the world. But you're also identified with the two most reviled ethnic groups in the world right now, Russians and Jews.
Yes, great times, good times to be here.
But I mean, it forgive me for banging on about the bleeding obvious, but I mean, there really has to be some clear blue water between one's birth identity by accident and the politics and the actions of governments for whom you show no support.
I might be a good example how all this identity politics logics don't work. And I hope to be maybe also a good conversation partner in how this is not how we're divided. We're not divided by nationality, especially when everybody who understands themselves as left say we're anti-nationalists. We cannot judge people by nationality. That doesn't work. I observe our times, and I'm very surprised by the harshness of our societies. I'm not surprised by the right. They promised us hate, they bring us hate. I'm surprised by those who call themselves left and turn their backs on people because they're Jewish or because they're from Israel. I will never accept that. And I have to say, it's a very interesting time to be everything I am and still being able to speak. I don't feel like I might be a marginalized body in the world and not safe everywhere, but I have this microphone in front of my face. So I don't feel that much being put in a corner. And I find it super important for everybody who feels marginalized to somehow find a way, become this person who is able to speak and share their reality. We cannot do more than share our experiences and say, look, this is what I do. And I cannot change where I was born. Plus, it's very funny because my family is from Ukraine, right? So you can imagine my grandfather, who is still alive and a very important figure for me, who is from Chernovitz, who is from West Ukraine, going through all this. And for me, it's important to observe his body, who survived the SS in West Ukraine, lived in Russia, and now he's in Germany, and there's things happening in the Middle East. So I think rather than judging, it's important to observe ourselves and the others. Our loved ones are the one who will show us, right?
Absolutely. Now, all of this really comes together in your latest book, Glorious People, which has just been so lauded. As I said, you've just won the biggest prize in German literature. People have talked about you as just one of the most startling and authentic voices in Germany writing today. I mean, the reviews I have in front of me just go on and on and on. So the novel follows the intertwined fates of two Russian-speaking Ukrainian women. They're called Lena and Tatiana. It's primarily set in Soviet-era Ukraine, and it eliminates the backstory behind the current conflict and really brings it very vividly to life. And it gives us, I suppose it gives us historical context, which helps with a more nuanced understanding of Ukrainians and of attitudes today. Was that the reason you set it in Ukraine today? Were you going to try and aid political understanding?
I wanted to understand myself. I oppose the idea that literature or art explains anything, right? We have journalism, so much great essayist thinkers for it. We're here to raise questions. And I had so many questions on Ukraine. I really didn't understand the conflict. As you said, the novel was published in 1921, so before the full-scale invasion. There was a war since 2014. And you have to imagine my mom has this extremely beautiful mishpocha around her with Russian and Ukrainian speaking women. And from 2014 on, their conversation became, of course, let's say, heated. And I was just curious. I was like, what is going on? Suddenly someone is Ukrainian, someone is Russian, they speak the same mother tongue. And whenever I would pose a question, they would say, but you know how it was. And I figured out I did not know how it was. And I did not know what they were talking about. So I was just very curious. And of course, I center to women in this novel very prominently because the history that is told in history books is always male. the idea of a victory is always male. Look at the monuments we got, right? And female history and female storytelling is always like there are fractions. They're so fragile. They're never a full story because they didn't even have an opportunity to tell their story. So I just sat down with friends of my mom, literally, and asked them for their stories. And it was clear that it is for a novel, but it was clear that I will not portray them, like exactly the way they tell me. So Lena, my heroine in the book, is a lot of different women. And it was fascinating to listen to them because they did not understand that they're heroines in general in their lives. They brought their children through very, very hard times. They brought them to Germany. They gave all of us, basically this book is dedicated to all migrant mothers, really, and to mothers in general. It's a huge bow in front of, this women who do everything for their children. And we don't even know. So I was really curious. I wanted to know what they've done to survive and to give this livable life to their children.
And of course, they came from very different backgrounds, your two protagonists, Tatiana and Lena. And yet they meet in Germany. They form such a close bond. Do you think that was common amongst immigrants from the USSR as it was at the time? People really coming from sometimes opposite ends of the spectrum, but being thrust together in this migrant situation.
I mean, I wish they would be connected more, and I wish there would be less things that divide us all. But I basically wanted also to show that a migrant is not a migrant. A woman that comes from Ukraine does not stand for all the women in Ukraine. So they come from very different economic background. They come from very different ideas about Ukraine and what was possible in Ukraine. And they end up in the same very poor situation in east of Germany, not a good place to be in, not back then, not now. And what was most fun to portray was a friendship between two women.
The title, Glorious People, is based on Uncle Vanya, right?
Yes,
by Chekhov.
Yeah.
I wonder how influential the great Russian writers are to you.
They are. I'm not going to lie. But it's also a joke that someone like me is referring to Anton Chekhov, who is the Russian writing playwright. And I am a playwright. And of course, everybody would read me through Russian theater culture, which is huge and absolutely fantastic. But there is also a playing with words because the saying, like the book in original is called Im Menschen muss alles herrlich sein. Everything about the human being has to be glorious. You can hear that it doesn't really work in translation. But this is the quote from Uncle Vanya from Chekhov, where there's a very, kind of like misogynistic situation where two guys are looking at the beautiful woman and say she's beautiful, but everything has to be wonderful and beautiful in a human being, not only the looks. And this sentence became something you just say in the Soviet Union to judge people, not only women. If I tell you, everything has to be glorious about you, it means that you're not there yet. So you have both of meanings. It sounds kind of nice and sweet, but then there is something very bitter and cynic in it. And I wanted both options to be in my title. It really worked. It's really funny and interesting for me to see how people react to this title. Because also, now you look at the UK translation, Glorious People, and then you open it up and it's Soviet Russian. Is that what you think about when you think about glorious people? Well, maybe.
Just talking about the situation in Russia today, I know you feel kind of detached from your Russian heritage, but both your novels have been set around the time of the USSR's collapse. Clearly, it had a huge kind of searing impact on your soul.
Yeah, I do not believe that if you're a writer or an artist in general, you can separate yourself from all these events. The question is, how obvious do you want to deal with them? How obvious do you want to portray them? Do you want to show that this is where you come from artistically, but also politically and sociologically? Or you want to just take it as inspiration, just take a Chekhov or a Mayakovsky and just play with that? We got all of these options, but for me, it's very important to know where I come from, to know what my possibilities are to continue from there.
Well, one of the possibilities for this particular piece of work is that it has been adapted for the stage several times.
Yes, I'm very happy about that. As a playwright, you can imagine, makes me very happy.
Yeah. Tell me about that, though, from turning a novel into a play.
Yeah, this is insane because, of course, actually I'm opposed to that because I think that theaters should stage plays. But in Germany, in German-speaking world, it's kind of like a thing to take, because I can explain you why. If you have a play, you have to stage it the way the playwright wrote it normally. Otherwise, the publishing house will show up. If you take a book, you can say it's inspired by, you do whatever. And so the theater is now, I think we have 7 adaptations. every theater is doing their own thing with that.
So these adaptations are not by you?
No, there is only one adaptation. I tried and I didn't like it because I write to understand something I don't know. And here I knew how the story ends. So I kind of like, because I know how to write proper dialogues which work, I did that, but it was not that much fun. And the theater still was kind of like adding their text and their images, which is fine. I like that. I like to be surprised. But I like the stagings more where I was not involved at all and it just came to experience and it becomes an own story. And, a theater, it's like if you write notes for a classical piece, and it's always just an interpretation of what you wrote. And it's fun to hear what people see in your work.
That's really refreshing. I come across so many people who are very, very protective of their work and don't want to see it adapted in a way that they haven't personally approved of.
Oh, I'm the opposite.
It's letting your babies go, though.
Totally. But, I started when I was 17. And of course, I had these experiences where I did not want to go on stage for the applause because I was so embarrassed. I had all this journey to a moment where I think if you say, for me, it's like not to everybody, for me, if you say you want to communicate with the society and with the outer world, if it's not just for your desk, but you want to speak to the others, they will speak back to you. So you better listen.
I just want to know about the translation process, because again, this is a little bit like letting your baby go, I suppose. I wonder what changed, what was crucial to retain in the English translation of the novel and how closely you were involved in that process. Obviously, your English is perfect. I wonder why you needed translation at all. In fact, Imogen Taylor did a great job, but just tell us about that aspect of it.
I'm a huge fan of Imogen Taylor particularly, and I adore translators. I adore the craft. I wrote a bit about what this whole process of, like starting from another text. It's a bit like you're starting in one country and then you go on the boat and end up on a different continent, because language is really defining every image and every smell has to be rethought and you have to really check every metaphor. So for me, the process of translation is a huge adventure you have to want to take. And I don't want to translate my own text, really not. This is where I'm just happy that there are other people also into Russian. I would never translate my text in Russian, although, of course, it's my mother tongue. Because I think that I was shaped by German language and my metaphors my humor is shaped by this language, if I like it or not. And Imogen Taylor is someone who I work very close with since my first novel, beside myself. And she also translated all my essays and some of pieces. She really knows how I function, how my language, and especially the humor and the melody of my sentences function. And I will never forget the first time I started to read beside myself, my first novel, her translation. I was a bit upset. I was like, I think the English one is better than the original, actually. And I tell you what, I think that I love the English language. I always did. And I'm not sure why. I'm not sure if it was because of the books or the movies or Shakespeare. I would have to make it up. I don't remember why. But I always liked the way this language functioned. And German is always a bit harder to get to, harder to reach, a little more intellectual, tries a little too hard. And I'm trying to take this effort out of the German language to sound more easy and readable. And this is why I think that English is really working with the way I want my language to flow.
Do you know what? I want to issue a challenge to our German and English-speaking listeners. Mm-hmm. I'd like them to read your book in German and also read it in English.
Oh, great.
I am so interested to know what differences they pick up on.
Absolutely.
And if the feeling of the book changes. So, listeners, please do that. You can always contact me on gg@monocle.com. I would really, really like to know about that. Sasha, what's next for you?
Of so many things at the same time. I'm going to Dublin to present the book. I'm going to Greece to do research for my third novel, my fourth book. I'm writing a piece right now, which is very exciting, for Salzburger Festspiele. So there are a lot of things are going on. And I'm teaching writing in Leipzig, which is, I think, my happy place.
Well, we're very happy to have had you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Glorious People is by Sasha Salzmann. It's published by Pushkin Press. And you've been listening to Meet the Writers, thanks to the production team of Tamsin Howard and George Ruskin. And you can download this show and previous episodes from our website, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your audio. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.